What defines family? Is it the name you carry, the blood running through your veins, or the walls that confine you? In a grand plantation house in Alabama, these questions were never meant to be asked. But when a secret held behind locked doors, whispered conversations, and carefully orchestrated lies begins to unravel, the very foundation of what seemed like an untouchable legacy starts to crack. This is the story of a bloodline that couldn't be erased, no matter how deeply it was buried. A story where truth lived in the mirror, in the curve of a jaw, in the color of eyes that shouldn't have matched. And when that truth finally surfaced, it didn't just destroy reputations. It shattered the carefully constructed reality of everyone who thought they knew who they were. What would you do if you discovered that the person serving you at the table was your own flesh and blood? The Belmont estate stretched across nearly 800 acres of rich Alabama soil, where cotton grew thick and white under the relentless southern sun. The main house stood 3 stories tall, with white columns that reached toward the sky like declarations of permanence and power. Inside, crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light, casting prismatic shadows across mahogany furniture imported from Europe. Charles Belmont inherited the estate in 1847 from his father, along with everything that came with it: the land, the debts, the reputation, and the 83 enslaved people whose labor kept the empire functioning. Charles was a man of contradictions. Educated at Harvard, well-read in philosophy, yet perfectly willing to maintain the brutal system that enriched him. He told himself he was a benevolent master, better than his neighbors who used the whip liberally. He provided adequate food, didn't separate families unnecessarily, and even allowed religious gatherings on Sundays. His wife, Margaret, was a Charleston beauty who brought her own inheritance to the marriage: 30 additional enslaved people and 200 acres that bordered the Belmont land. She was devout, attending church every Sunday, organizing charity events for poor white families in town, and maintaining the image of a perfect Southern lady. She never raised her voice, never showed emotion in public, and ran the household with clockwork precision. They had 3 children. Victoria, 16 years old, with her mother's delicate features and obsession with propriety. Thomas, 14, already being groomed to take over the estate. And little Anne, only 8, still innocent to the complexities of the world she inhabited. Among the enslaved population lived a young man named Samuel. He was 24 years old, though no one knew his exact birth date. Such details weren't recorded for people considered property. Samuel worked primarily in the main house, serving meals, maintaining the library, polishing silver, and performing the dozens of invisible tasks that kept wealthy families comfortable. What made Samuel different wasn't his intelligence, though he was remarkably sharp, despite being forbidden to read. It wasn't his quiet dignity, though he carried himself with a composure that sometimes made visitors uncomfortable. What made Samuel different was something no one dared to speak about openly, something that existed in the realm of careful glances and quickly averted eyes. Samuel looked almost identical to Charles Belmont. Not similar, not reminiscent, nearly identical. The same strong jawline, the same deep-set hazel eyes that shifted between green and brown depending on the light, the same distinctive widow's peak in the hairline, the same proportions: tall, broad-shouldered, with long fingers and a particular way of tilting the head when listening. The resemblance was so striking that visiting guests sometimes did a double-take, their brains momentarily confused by what their eyes reported. But those moments passed quickly. In the South of 1847, there were truths everyone understood without needing to speak them, and some resemblances were better left unexamined. Margaret Belmont had rules. Samuel was never to serve dinner when they had guests from Charleston or Savannah, those who knew Margaret's family and might ask uncomfortable questions. During those occasions, Jacob, an older enslaved man with graying hair and weathered features, took over serving duties. Samuel was never to be in the same room as Charles during family portraits or formal gatherings that might be photographed or painted. Margaret scheduled these events carefully, always ensuring Samuel had other duties during those times. Samuel was never to speak unless spoken to, never to make direct eye contact with Victoria, and never, absolutely never, to be seen standing next to Charles Belmont, where comparisons could be easily drawn. These weren't rules Margaret ever stated explicitly. They were simply understood, enforced through meaningful looks from the head housekeeper, Dinah, a woman in her 50s who'd served the Belmont family since before Charles was born. Dinah knew things, she'd seen things, and she understood that her survival, and Samuel's, depended on maintaining very specific boundaries. But there was something else, something that made the situation even more complicated. Margaret treated Samuel differently. Not kindly, exactly. Margaret was never cruel to any of the enslaved people in an overt way. That would have been beneath her dignity. But with Samuel there was a coldness that went beyond her usual detachment. When he served her tea, she would never thank him, whereas she might offer a curt nod to others. When he entered a room, her shoulders would tense almost imperceptibly. She would find small faults: the silver wasn't polished enough, the curtains weren't hung precisely straight, and ensure Dinah reprimanded him. It was the behavior of someone who resented an injustice they couldn't correct. Charles, on the other hand, displayed a different peculiarity. He never looked directly at Samuel, not once. When Samuel served his dinner, Charles would stare at his plate, at the wall, at his wife, anywhere but at the young man standing 3 feet away. When Samuel spoke in response to a question, Charles would nod without raising his eyes. The other enslaved people noticed. They talked about it in the quarters late at night, speaking in whispers and half-finished sentences. "The master's afraid of his own face," old Marcus said one evening, staring into the small fire they'd built for warmth. "Hush that talk," Dinah snapped. Though her eyes showed she agreed. Some truths are dangerous for everyone. Samuel himself rarely spoke about it. What was there to say? He'd grown up on the Belmont estate, born to Lily, a woman who'd worked in the main house until her death from fever when Samuel was 12. Lily had been beautiful once, with smooth features and eyes that carried intelligence she'd never been allowed to use. She'd also taken her secrets to the grave. In April of 1849, everything changed with the arrival of Dr. William Harrison. Harrison was a physician from Boston, traveling through the South to study blood diseases and hereditary conditions. He'd developed a theory about blood types and family inheritance patterns, revolutionary ideas that wouldn't be fully understood for another 50 years. He was documenting family medical histories, looking for patterns in inherited traits, diseases that ran in bloodlines. Charles Belmont, always eager to appear progressive and scientific, invited Dr. Harrison to stay at the estate for 2 weeks. It would be good for his reputation to host such a distinguished northern scientist, to show that southern gentlemen valued knowledge and advancement. Dr. Harrison arrived on a Thursday afternoon, his carriage loaded with medical equipment, notebooks, and various instruments that fascinated young Thomas. Margaret organized a welcoming dinner, inviting neighbors from surrounding plantations to meet their educated guest. Samuel served the meal. Dr. Harrison was mid-conversation with Charles about Harvard. They'd attended a decade apart, when Samuel leaned forward to pour wine. The doctor stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes moving between Samuel and Charles with the analytical gaze of someone trained to notice details. "Remarkable," Harrison said quietly. The table fell silent. Margaret's hand tightened on her fork. "What is?" Charles asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The servants here, they're well-formed, good constitutions." Harrison seemed to catch himself, returning to his wine. "You must ensure adequate nutrition. So many plantations neglect basic health maintenance." The conversation resumed, but Margaret had noticed that brief moment, that flash of scientific curiosity in Harrison's eyes as they moved between her husband and the enslaved man pouring his wine. Over the following days, Dr. Harrison conducted his research. He interviewed the Belmont family about their medical history. Who died of what ailments ran in the family, any unusual conditions or traits. He sketched family trees, documenting patterns of inheritance. Margaret watched nervously as he worked, finding excuses to be present during his interviews, subtly steering conversations away from certain topics. On the fifth day, Harrison asked Charles an unexpected question during their afternoon conversation in the study. "Your father, did he maintain detailed records of the plantation? Medical records, birth records, that sort of thing?" "Some," Charles replied cautiously. "Why do you ask?" "I'm interested in hereditary patterns across generations. Sometimes studying the health of an entire estate population can reveal fascinating patterns." Harrison smiled pleasantly. "Would you mind if I examined those records? Purely for research purposes?" Charles hesitated. "I'm not sure they'd be useful to you. They're rather incomplete. Nevertheless, I'd be grateful for the opportunity." Something in Harrison's tone made it clear this wasn't a casual request. Charles agreed, showing him to the estate office where decades of ledgers were kept in locked cabinets. Harrison spent 3 days in that office, and what he found there began to construct a picture that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Belmont records were meticulous in some ways, sparse in others. Financial transactions were documented precisely. Every purchase, every sale, every expense. Birth records for enslaved people were noted, but usually just Lily, female infant, born March, or Marcus, male infant, born to Sarah. But Dr. Harrison wasn't looking at the standard entries. He was looking at the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where the careful record-keeping suddenly became vague. In March of 1825, there was an entry. Lily, aged 16, assigned to house duties. In December of 1825, several pages had been torn out. The ledger jumped from December 3rd to December 28th with no explanation. In January of 1826, there was a brief note, L, confined to quarters, illness. In April of 1826, male infant born, healthy. No mother listed, no name given, just that single line, unusual in its brevity. 2 pages later, Samuel, male infant, born to Lily, April 1826. Harrison cross-referenced other records from that period. In December 1825, Charles Belmont Sr., the current Charles's father, had made a substantial payment to a doctor from Mobile, an unusual expense noted as consultation fees. The amount was significant, far more than a typical medical visit would cost. In January 1826, Charles Sr. had been away from the estate for 3 weeks, also unusual. The plantation ledger showed business in New Orleans, but no corresponding business transactions appeared in the financial records. Harrison found another interesting detail, a letter fragment used as a bookmark in one of the ledgers, dated December 1825. It was in an elderly woman's handwriting, addressed to Charles Belmont Sr. "You cannot escape the consequences of your actions. That girl is 16 years old. What you've done is your own responsibility, and God will judge you for it. Even if the law will not, you must make provisions." The letter wasn't signed, but the handwriting matched other correspondence from Abigail Belmont, Charles Sr.'s mother, a woman known for her strict moral code who died in 1827. Harrison sat back in the office chair, the pieces assembling themselves into an undeniable picture. Charles Belmont Sr. had fathered a child with Lily when she was 16 years old. That child was Samuel, which meant Samuel was the half-brother to the current Charles Belmont, an uncle to Victoria, Thomas, and Anne. The current Charles had been born in 1820, making him 6 years old when Samuel was born. Old enough, perhaps, to have vague memories of household tension, whispered arguments, his grandmother's tight-lipped disapproval. Did Charles know? Harrison suspected he did. That would explain the avoidance, the careful rules, the way Charles navigated the house, ensuring he and Samuel were never in the same social space simultaneously. Did Margaret know? Harrison suspected she did too. That would explain her cold treatment of Samuel, her carefully orchestrated exclusions. She wasn't cruel to him out of general hardness. She was cruel to him because he was a living reminder of her husband's bloodline, a reminder that her children shared ancestry with an enslaved man, that the purity she obsessed over was already compromised. But there was something else Harrison found. something that transformed this from a tragic but common story of exploitation into something far more disturbing. In the medical records Harrison requested from the local doctor who served the Belmont family, there was documentation of a serious illness that had struck Victoria in 1847, 2 years before Harrison's arrival. She'd developed a severe fever and mysterious bleeding condition. The local doctor had been baffled, trying various treatments that failed. Victoria had deteriorated rapidly, growing pale and weak until there was genuine fear she might die. The doctor's notes described a desperate attempt. Patient required blood replacement, standard leaching failed. Attempted direct blood transfusion as experimental treatment. Blood transfusion in 1847 was extremely rare and dangerous, barely understood. The doctor's notes continued. Family members tested for compatibility. Mother experienced severe reaction, deemed unsuitable. Father experienced moderate reaction, deemed too risky. Brother Thomas too young, deemed unsuitable. Searched household for compatible donor. And then, successful transfusion performed using household servant S. Remarkable compatibility. Patient responded well. Recovery began within 24 hours. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he read this. They had used Samuel's blood to save Victoria's life. In 1847, medical science didn't understand blood types. The ABO blood type system wouldn't be discovered until 1901. Transfusions were essentially trial and error. Most resulted in severe reactions and death. The fact that Samuel's blood not only didn't kill Victoria, but actually saved her was significant. It suggested close genetic compatibility. It suggested family. Harrison reviewed the doctor's notes more carefully. There were observations about the similarities in blood appearance and behavior between Samuel and the Belmont family samples. The doctor had noted it as curious, but hadn't drawn any conclusions beyond the successful medical outcome. But Harrison understood what this meant. The Belmonts had used Samuel's blood, the blood of Charles's half-brother, to save Charles's daughter. They had literally shared blood in the most direct way possible. Victoria was alive because the enslaved man who served her dinner carried the same bloodline she did. And they all knew. Charles had been there during the transfusion, had witnessed Samuel's blood flowing into his daughter's veins. Margaret had been there, watching the one person she most resented save the child she most loved. Victoria herself had been semi-conscious but aware enough to understand what was happening. The secret wasn't just about Samuel's parentage anymore. It was about a debt that could never be acknowledged, a life saved by blood that officially wasn't supposed to be related at all. Harrison closed the medical records, his mind racing. He was a man of science, yes, but he was also from Boston, where abolitionist sentiment ran strong. He'd witnessed slavery firsthand during his southern travels, had documented the medical neglect, the preventable diseases, the shortened lifespans. But this was different. This was a family literally sustained by the very person they enslaved, bound by blood they refused to recognize. What was he supposed to do with this information? Dr. Harrison made a decision that would prove catastrophic. On his 10th day at the estate, he requested a private conversation with Charles. They met in the study after dinner. Brandy poured, door closed. Margaret, with the intuition of someone constantly monitoring for threats, lingered near the hallway, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. "Mr. Belmont," Harrison began, "my research here has been enlightening." Charles stiffened slightly. "I'm glad to have been of assistance to your scientific endeavors. I've reviewed your family's medical history quite thoroughly. The records, the treatments, the various interventions over the years." Harrison paused. "Including your daughter's remarkable recovery in 1847. The room temperature seemed to drop. Victoria's illness was a difficult time for our family," Charles said carefully. "We're grateful to God for her recovery." "And to Samuel?" Harrison asked quietly. Charles's hand tightened on his brandy glass. Samuel performed a service when asked, as would be expected. a service most family members couldn't provide. Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Belmont, I'm a man of science. I understand heredity, blood compatibility, physical inheritance patterns. I've also reviewed your estate records quite thoroughly. You overstep, sir. Do I? Or am I simply stating what everyone in this house already knows but refuses to speak? Harrison's voice was firm but not unkind. Your father's choices created a situation that continues to stop. Charles stood abruptly, his face flushed. You know nothing of my family's private affairs. You come here as a guest, abuse my hospitality by prying into confidential records, and now I presume to point out an injustice. That young man is your brother, and you keep him in bondage. The word hung in the air between them, finally spoken aloud. Brother. Charles's face went through several emotions: anger, fear, shame, and finally a cold hardness. Samuel is property of this estate, as documented in legal records. The circumstances of his birth are irrelevant to his legal status. Even if your insinuations had any merit, which I neither confirm nor deny, it would change precisely nothing. Charles moved toward the door. Your stay here is concluded, Dr. Harrison. I'll have your things prepared. A carriage will take you to Mobile in the morning. Mr. Belmont, this conversation is over. But it wasn't over, because Margaret had heard every word through the door, her face pale, her hands shaking, and because Victoria had been coming down the stairs to ask her father something, and had paused on the landing, listening with growing horror to the exchange. And because Samuel himself was in the hallway, having just finished his evening duties, frozen in place as he heard the truth of his parentage confirmed in angry words for the first time in his life. The secret was no longer secret. Dr. Harrison left the following morning under tense circumstances. Charles didn't come down to see him off. Margaret appeared briefly, her face a mask of rigid politeness, offering no warmth as the carriage pulled away. But Harrison's visit had cracked something open that couldn't be sealed again. Victoria stopped eating. She would sit at the dinner table, staring at her food, occasionally glancing toward Samuel when he served, her eyes searching his face for the resemblance she'd never consciously registered before. Now that it had been pointed out, she couldn't unsee it. The uncle who'd saved her life served her in silence, the blood running through her veins, his blood, had given her a second chance at life. And yet he slept in a small cabin, owned nothing, had no future beyond servitude. She began asking questions Margaret refused to answer. Mother, why does Samuel look like father? You're imagining things. Eat your dinner. I'm not imagining it. Everyone sees it. Why does no one speak of it? Victoria, this is not a topic for discussion. Is he father's brother? Margaret slammed her hand on the table with uncharacteristic violence, making the crystal rattle. You will never ask that question again. Do you understand me? Victoria understood. She understood that the answer was yes. Thomas, overhearing these exchanges, began his own observations. He'd always been a clever boy, good with numbers and logic. He started calculating ages, reviewing family stories he'd heard, noticing things he'd previously overlooked. The way their grandmother's portrait seemed to have the same eyes as Samuel. The way father avoided certain rooms when Samuel was working there. Anne, only 10 now, didn't understand the tensions but felt them. She started having nightmares, crying out in the night for comfort that came slowly, if at all. The household was fracturing. Meanwhile, Samuel was experiencing his own crisis. At 24 years old, he'd just learned the confirmed truth of something he'd perhaps suspected, but never allowed himself to fully believe. Charles Belmont, the man who owned him, was his half-brother. The children he served were his niece and nephews. The blood they'd taken from him to save Victoria wasn't just compatible by chance, it was family blood. Samuel found himself staring at Charles during those rare moments when their paths crossed, searching for something, recognition, guilt, anything human. But Charles had perfected his avoidance, his eyes sliding past Samuel as if he were furniture. Dinah noticed Samuel's growing agitation and pulled him aside one evening in the kitchen. You need to bury this deep, she said urgently. Nothing good comes from this truth being out. You hear me? How can I pretend I don't know? Samuel's voice was strained. How can I? You survive. Same way your mother survived. Same way all of us survive. Dinah gripped his shoulders. The master won't acknowledge you. He can't. It would destroy everything. His marriage, his standing, his children's future. And if you push it, if you make it impossible for him to ignore, he'll solve the problem the only way he can. Samuel understood. He could be sold. Sent so far away that the resemblance wouldn't matter anymore, that the uncomfortable truth could be erased by distance. Or worse. But they used my blood, Samuel said quietly. They took from me to save her. And you think that gives you rights? You think that makes you family? Dinah's eyes were sad. Boy, it makes you useful, that's all. Don't mistake necessity for recognition. Victoria Belmont had been raised to be a proper Southern lady, obedient, graceful, concerned with reputation and marriage prospects. At 18 years old in 1849, she should have been focused on the upcoming social season, on which young men from good families might court her. Instead, she was consumed by moral crisis. She couldn't stop thinking about it. She'd lie awake at night, remembering the fever, the delirium, the moment of waking up to see Samuel's face, pale from blood loss, as the doctor worked with his primitive equipment to transfer life from his veins to hers. She'd asked weakly, "What's happening?" And her father had answered, "He's helping you. Don't speak. Save your strength." He's helping you. Not a relative, not family, just he. An unnamed service provider. Victoria began doing something dangerous. She started observing Samuel as a person. She noticed how he read titles of books while shelving them, his fingers lingering on the spines, as if memorizing words he'd never been taught to decipher. She noticed how he was gentle with Anne when the child ran through the hallways, how he'd steady her with a hand on her shoulder and a soft, careful little miss that carried avuncular warmth. She noticed he had their grandmother's hands, the same long fingers, the same distinctive shape to the nails. One afternoon, when her mother was at a social call and her father was in the fields, Victoria did something absolutely forbidden. She went to the kitchen where Samuel was polishing silver and dismissed the other servants. "I want to speak with you," she said quietly. Samuel looked up, alarm in his eyes. "Miss Victoria, that wouldn't be appropriate. 2 years ago, you saved my life." Silence. "I was dying, and they used your blood because my own family's blood couldn't save me." Victoria's voice shook. "Why did you agree to it?" Samuel stared at the silver in his hands. "I wasn't asked to agree, miss. I was told." "But did you—" Victoria struggled for words. "Did you want to? If you'd had a choice?" For the first time, Samuel looked directly at her. "You were 14 years old and dying. Whatever else is true or not true, whatever anyone says or doesn't say about who is related to who, you were a child. So yes, I would have chosen to help." "You're my uncle," Victoria whispered. "I'm not anything official, Miss Victoria, and you're putting both of us in danger by saying so." "It's the truth. Truth doesn't matter much when the law says otherwise." Samuel set down the silver. "You should go. This conversation can't happen." But Victoria didn't go. Instead, she asked a question that would set everything in motion. "What if I could change it? What if I could make them acknowledge it?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. "How? You're 18 and a woman. You own nothing, decide nothing. You're almost as much property as I am, just with better quarters." "I'll find a way," Victoria said with sudden determination. "You gave me life. I won't waste it pretending you don't matter." What Victoria did next was remarkably clever for someone with no power or resources. She began with documentation. Over several weeks, she carefully removed several pages from her father's study when he was distracted. Pages from the old ledgers that showed the gaps, the unusual payments, the timeline of Samuel's birth. She couldn't take too much without it being noticed, but she took enough. She also began writing letters. Letters to her Aunt Clara in Charleston, Margaret's sister, who was known for being more progressive, who'd once expressed discomfort with slavery in Victoria's presence. Letters carefully worded to ask about family secrets and moral obligations without being too specific. Aunt Clara wrote back, intrigued, asking for details. Victoria provided them in coded language, describing a situation where a family member isn't recognized as such due to circumstances of birth. Clara understood immediately. She wrote, "If what you're suggesting is true, this is a matter of profound moral consequence. But Victoria, dear child, you must understand, there is no legal remedy. The law is absolute on these matters. Even if acknowledged, nothing changes legally." "What about morally?" Victoria wrote back. "What about before God? You've said yourself that slavery is a sin. How much greater the sin when it's our own blood?" This correspondence continued for months. Clara, childless and wealthy from her late husband's shipping fortune, began to form an idea. Meanwhile, the tension in the Belmont household grew unbearable. Charles had discovered that Harrison had examined the old records in detail and became paranoid about what else the doctor might have found or whom he might tell. He sent letters to medical societies Harrison was associated with, carefully worded to undermine his credibility should Harrison speak publicly about what he'd discovered. Margaret increased her control over household operations, implementing even stricter rules about Samuel's duties and movements. She had him reassigned from house service to working in the fields, a demotion that everyone understood as punishment, though no one could say for what. But Samuel was not physically suited to field work after years in the house, and he began to suffer. His hands, used to careful polishing and serving, blistered and bled from the cotton harvest. His back, unaccustomed to the constant bending, developed chronic pain. Dinah protested to Margaret. "He's a house servant, Mom. He doesn't have the constitution for field labor." "Then he'll develop it," Margaret replied coldly. "I've made my decision." Victoria watched Samuel deteriorate over several weeks, watched him come back to the main house in the evenings. He still slept in the house servants' quarters, with hands wrapped in strips of cloth, moving stiffly from pain. She made her own decision. In November of 1849, Victoria wrote to Aunt Clara, "I'm prepared to take action, whatever the consequences. Please come." Clara arrived in early December, her carriage loaded with trunks, announcing she'd come for an extended visit through the Christmas season. Margaret was surprised, but couldn't refuse her own sister, especially one as wealthy and socially connected as Clara. What Margaret didn't know was that Clara had brought something with her. Legal documents prepared by a progressive lawyer in Charleston, documents that represented a radical plan. Clara spent her first week simply observing. She watched how the household operated, how Margaret controlled everything with tight precision, how Charles avoided certain spaces and people. She watched Samuel, noting the resemblance that was so obvious it was almost absurd that everyone pretended not to see it. She also spent time with Victoria, who explained everything in whispered late-night conversations in her bedroom. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Clara asked her niece. "If we proceed, there's no going back. Your mother will never forgive you. Your father might disown you. Society will turn against you." "He saved my life," Victoria said simply, "and they worked him in the fields like an animal as punishment for what? For existing. For looking like what he is. This won't free him," Clara warned. "Even if everything we plan succeeds, the law won't change. You understand that?" "I understand. But there are different kinds of freedom." Clara nodded slowly. "Then we proceed. But we must be extraordinarily careful." The plan was complex and relied on legal technicalities that were rare but possible. Clara would purchase Samuel from Charles. This in itself wasn't unusual. Family members sometimes sold enslaved people to each other for various reasons. Charles would have no particular reason to refuse a good offer from his sister-in-law. Once Samuel was Clara's property, she would take him to Charleston. South Carolina law, while still maintaining slavery, had provisions that allowed for voluntary enslavement, a legal status where an enslaved person could theoretically choose to remain enslaved rather than face the dangers of being free black in the South. More importantly, the same legal framework had a rarely used provision allowing for manumission under specific conditions, including being transported to a northern state. Clara would take Samuel to Pennsylvania, where she had connections to abolitionist communities. There, she would free him legally and help him establish a new identity. Victoria's role was different. She would create undeniable public documentation of Samuel's parentage and the blood transfusion before he left. Not to change his legal status, that was impossible, but to create a historical record, something that couldn't be erased or denied by future Belmont generations. It was revenge in a way, revenge against a family that valued reputation above all else. A permanent stain on the Belmont name that would exist in official records, accessible to historians, genealogists, anyone who looked carefully enough. The plan was dangerous, potentially deadly if handled wrong. But Clara was wealthy enough to be semi-untouchable, and Victoria was determined enough to accept the consequences. They began in mid-December of 1849. Clara approached Charles casually one afternoon as he reviewed accounts in his study. "Charles, I have a proposition for you." He looked up, distracted. "Yes? I'm in need of a personal manservant for my household in Charleston, someone trained, competent, capable of managing a large house." Clara settled into a chair. "I notice you have a young man here, Samuel, I believe, who seems quite capable." Charles froze, his pen stopping mid-stroke. "I'd like to purchase him," Clara continued smoothly. "I'm prepared to offer above market value. Say, $1,200. It was indeed above market value, significantly so. Charles could use the money. The plantation always needed capital. But he stared at Clara with suspicion. "Samuel is adequate at his duties here. I'm not certain I wish to sell him. Come now, Charles. You have plenty of house servants. Margaret mentioned you recently assigned him to fieldwork anyway, so clearly he's not essential to household operations." Clara smiled pleasantly. $1,200 is generous. Take it as a gesture of family goodwill. Charles felt trapped. Refusing a generous offer from his sister-in-law without good reason would raise questions. He couldn't say, "I can't sell him because he's my half-brother and having him nearby is complicated enough," without explaining a refusal. "I'll consider it," he finally said. "Wonderful. Shall we say you'll give me your answer by the end of the week?" That evening Charles discussed it with Margaret in their bedroom. "She knows," Margaret said immediately. "Victoria told her. This is some plot." "A plot to do what? Buy him and take him to Charleston? That solves our problem." "Does it?" Margaret's eyes were hard. "Or does it put him in the hands of someone who might free him, might give him education, might create an even bigger scandal than his presence here?" "Clara wouldn't. She's your sister. She's always been too soft on the slavery question. You know she supports gradual abolition." Margaret paced the room. "If she takes him, we lose control of the situation entirely." "We don't have control now," Charles said tiredly. "Harrison knows. Victoria knows. Probably half the household knows. The secret is out, Margaret. The best we can do is manage it. By selling him to my sister. By removing the visible reminder of my father's indiscretion." They agreed to the sale. Charles told himself it was a business decision, nothing more. But when he signed the bill of sale 3 days later, his hand shook slightly, the ink blotting. Samuel was informed he'd been sold and would be leaving for Charleston after Christmas. He received the news in silence, his face unreadable. But that night, in the servants' quarters, he wept for the first time since his mother's death. Not from sadness at leaving, but from the overwhelming confusion of grief for a family that had never been his, for a brother who'd never acknowledged him, for a life that might have been different if he'd been born in the main house instead of the cabin. Before they left, Victoria executed her part of the plan. She went to Judge Morrison in town, an old family friend who'd known the Belmonts for decades. She requested a private meeting, saying she needed to make a formal deposition for family records. Judge Morrison, elderly and slightly confused by the request, agreed. Such depositions were sometimes made for inheritance purposes or family history documentation. Victoria arrived with written testimony she'd prepared meticulously. I, Victoria Belmont, being of sound mind, do hereby testify to the following facts for the historical record. In October of 1847, I suffered a severe illness that brought me to the point of death. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Matthews of Willow County, attempted various treatments that proved unsuccessful. As a final experimental measure, Dr. Matthews attempted a blood transfusion, a rare medical procedure. My mother, Margaret Belmont, was tested and found incompatible. My father, Charles Belmont, was tested and found moderately compatible, but the doctor deemed the procedure too risky. The enslaved person Samuel, property of the Belmont estate, was tested and found highly compatible. The transfusion was performed successfully, and I credit my survival to this intervention. I further testify that Samuel bears remarkable physical resemblance to my father and to my paternal grandmother, the late Mrs. Abigail Belmont. This resemblance has been noted by numerous household members and visitors over the years. It is my belief, based on documented timelines in estate records and confirmed by investigation of family correspondence, that Samuel is the biological son of my grandfather, Charles Belmont Sr., and the enslaved woman Lily, who died in 1838. This would make Samuel my father's half-brother and my biological uncle. I make this testimony not to challenge any legal arrangements, as I understand the law is absolute in these matters, but to ensure that the truth is preserved for historical record, and to acknowledge that the blood flowing through my veins, blood that saved my life, is the blood of a man denied his rightful place in our family. Signed this 22nd day of December, 1849, Victoria Belmont. Judge Morrison read the document slowly, his face growing increasingly pale. Miss Victoria, do you understand what you're creating here? Yes, sir. A truthful record. This will destroy your family's reputation. Your father will be... My father already knows the truth, Judge Morrison. So does my mother. So does everyone who looks carefully. I'm simply ensuring it can't be conveniently forgotten. Your marriage prospects are less important than doing what's right. The judge stared at her for a long moment. He was old, had lived through enough years to see the cracks in the system he'd helped enforce. He thought about his own compromises, his own moral flexibility in service of social stability. Finally, he notarized the document. This will be placed in the county records, he said quietly. It will exist permanently. Good. Victoria walked out of that office feeling lighter than she had in months. She knew what was coming. Her parents' fury, social ostracization, possibly being sent away to distant relatives. But she'd done it. She'd made the truth official. Charles Belmont learned about the deposition 2 days later, when Judge Morrison, feeling obligated by their friendship, sent him a private note. The rage that followed was unlike anything the household had ever witnessed. Charles stormed into Victoria's room, the notarized document in his hand, his face purple with fury. "What have you done?" he shouted. "What in God's name have you done?" Victoria stood calmly, though her heart raced. "I've told the truth. You've destroyed this family. You've made us the subject of gossip and scandal. Do you understand what this means? It means people will know that you enslaved your own uncle. He is not my uncle. He is property, legal property. He has your blood, my blood. How can you..." Margaret rushed in, having heard the shouting. When she saw the document, she went absolutely white. "You foolish, foolish girl," she whispered. "You've ruined everything. I've exposed what already existed." Victoria shot back. The ruin was already there, hidden behind your careful rules and father's avoidance. "You will be sent away," Charles said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "You will go to your Aunt Beatrice in Virginia tomorrow. You will stay there until I decide you've learned discretion. I won't go. You're 18 years old and unmarried. You'll go where I send you. I'm 18 years old and the author of a legal document that's now part of county records. If I disappear to Virginia under mysterious circumstances right after filing that testimony, it will only draw more attention. Victoria's voice was steady. You taught me to think strategically, Father. You just never expected me to use it against you. Charles stared at his daughter as if seeing a stranger. Margaret sank into a chair, her perfect composure finally cracking. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why would you do this to us? Because it was wrong, Victoria said quietly, and because I refused to build my life on convenient lies. Samuel left for Charleston with Clara on December 28, 1849. The Belmont family didn't gather to see him off. Charles was locked in his study, drinking brandy at 10 in the morning. Margaret was in her bedroom, claiming a headache. Thomas and Anne watched from an upstairs window, confused by the tensions they didn't fully understand. Only Victoria came outside. She approached the carriage where Samuel waited, his few possessions in a small bag. I don't know if what I did helped or made things worse for you, she said quietly. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. You tried to make it right. That's more than anyone else ever did. Aunt Clara will take care of you. She's taking me north, to freedom. Samuel glanced back at the house. That's more than I ever expected. It's less than you deserve. Maybe. Samuel's expression was complicated. Miss Victoria, when you look in the mirror, you'll see my blood in you. Remember, it made you strong enough to do this. That's worth something. Clara called from the carriage. We need to go. The ferry won't wait. Victoria watched the carriage pull away, watched until it disappeared down the oak-lined drive. She didn't cry. She'd already spent all her tears. Behind her, she heard her father's study door slam. The fight that followed lasted weeks. Victoria was confined to her room, her meals brought by servants who weren't allowed to speak to her. Letters from Aunt Clara were intercepted and destroyed. Charles contacted every eligible family within 200 miles, making it clear that Victoria was emotionally unstable and not suitable for marriage. He was systematically destroying her future as punishment for her rebellion. But Victoria had expected this. She'd made her choice knowing the cost. What she didn't expect was Thomas's reaction. Thomas was 16 now, old enough to understand the full implications of what Victoria had exposed. At first, he'd been angry with his sister for bringing shame to the family, but as weeks passed and he watched his parents' increasingly unhinged behavior, he began to question everything he'd been taught. He snuck into Victoria's room one night, evading their mother's surveillance. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble. "Is Samuel really grandfather's son?" Victoria, pale from weeks of isolation, nodded. "The records prove it. The resemblance proves it. The blood transfusion proves it. Then we enslaved our own uncle." "Yes." Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, his head in his hands. "How do we live with that?" "Father seems to manage," Victoria said bitterly. "Father is drinking himself unconscious every night. Mother hasn't smiled in a month. You're locked in here like a prisoner. Anne keeps asking what's wrong and no one will tell her." Thomas looked up. "This isn't managing, this is falling apart." "Good," Victoria said fiercely. "Maybe it should fall apart. Maybe it was built on things that deserved to collapse." Thomas left without responding, but something had shifted in him. Over the following months, he began his own investigation. He read his grandfather's old letters, reviewed estate records, talked to elderly enslaved people who'd been on the plantation for decades. Each piece of evidence confirmed what he already knew. His grandfather had fathered a child with a 16-year-old enslaved girl. Rather than free the child, he'd kept him enslaved. When grandfather died, the property had passed to Charles, along with the land and the debts and the silver. Charles had grown up knowing, or at least suspecting, and he'd done nothing. He'd kept his own half-brother in bondage, had taken his blood to save Victoria, and then punished him by sending him to brutal field work when the secret threatened to become public. The weight of this knowledge fundamentally changed Thomas. He stopped participating in family prayers, stopped pretending things were normal. He became quiet, withdrawn, prone to long walks alone. Margaret noticed. "The girl has poisoned your mind," she told him one evening. Victoria told the truth, Thomas replied. "That's not poison. The truth is dangerous when it destroys good order." "Maybe the order wasn't that good." Margaret slapped him, the sound sharp in the quiet parlor. It was the first and only time she'd ever struck one of her children. She immediately burst into tears, not from remorse, but from the realization that she was losing control of her family, that the careful structure she'd maintained was disintegrating. In March of 1850, a letter arrived from Clara. It was addressed to Victoria, but intercepted by Margaret, who read it with shaking hands. "Dearest Victoria, our friend has arrived safely in Philadelphia. The journey was long but without incident. He is staying with associates of mine, good people who are helping him adjust to his new circumstances. The legal process was completed successfully in Pennsylvania. He is now a free man under Northern law, though we both understand he can never safely return south. He asked me to convey his gratitude to you. He says you gave him something he never expected to have. Acknowledgement. Even if it came at great personal cost to you, he wants you to know it mattered. He's learning to read now. The first book he requested was a Bible, which he says his mother once described to him. The second was a medical text. He wishes to understand the process that saved your life. He has chosen a new surname for his freedom papers, Freeman. He knows it's common, but he says it represents exactly what he is now. With love, Aunt Clara." Margaret read the letter 3 times, each reading fueling her fury. Samuel was free. The man who represented her husband's shameful bloodline, who'd been a constant reminder of her family's moral compromise, was now beyond her reach, living freely in the North, learning to read, claiming a dignity that the entire Southern social structure said he had no right to possess. And Victoria had made it possible. Margaret made a decision that night. She would erase Victoria from the family, just as they'd tried to erase Samuel. She began spreading rumors through her social network that Victoria had become mentally unstable, prone to delusions and inappropriate fixations. She contacted convents in Louisiana and Georgia, institutions that took in troubled young women from good families for indefinite stays. Charles, drowning in alcohol and self-loathing, offered no resistance to Margaret's plans. But before Margaret could execute her plan to send Victoria away, something unexpected happened. Judge Morrison died. Judge Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in April of 1850 at the age of 74. The funeral was well attended. He'd been a pillar of the community for decades. But at the reading of his will, there was a surprise provision. The judge had left a sealed letter to be delivered to the Alabama Historical Society upon his death. The letter contained copies of Victoria's deposition, along with supporting evidence from plantation records that the judge had apparently requested and copied before he died. The letter also contained the judge's own testimony. "I have served the law for 50 years, and I have made compromises with my conscience in service of social stability. But there are truths that deserve to be preserved, even when they are uncomfortable." The attached documents detail a situation where legal ownership conflicted with biological reality and moral duty. They describe how the Belmont family of Willow County maintained a man in slavery who was, by blood, a member of that same family. I submit these documents not to challenge the legal system, but to ensure that future generations, should they examine the institution of slavery with clearer eyes, will have evidence of its profound moral corruptions, including the enslavement of one's own kin. This is my testimony, and I stand by its accuracy. Judge William Morrison, April 1850. When this became known, and in small communities such things always became known, the social consequences for the Belmont family were devastating. They weren't ostracized completely. They were too wealthy and powerful for that. But they became subjects of gossip, speculation, and moral judgment. Families that might have courted Victoria's hand made it clear their sons weren't interested. Business partners became suddenly distant. Church ladies whispered. The perfect facade Margaret had maintained for decades crumbled in weeks. Charles retreated entirely from social life, managing the plantation from his study, seeing no one outside the immediate family. His drinking increased, his health deteriorated. Margaret became brittle and harsh, her previous controlled coldness transforming into something sharper. She fired servants for minor infractions, implemented stricter controls, and began attending church 3 times per week, as if piety might restore what had been lost. And Victoria remained trapped in the house, unmarriageable, socially ruined, but oddly at peace. In June of 1851, another letter arrived from Clara, this time addressed to Thomas and successfully reaching him before Margaret could intercept it. Dear Thomas, I write to you because I believe you've developed the wisdom to understand complex truths. Samuel is thriving in Philadelphia. He's found work as an apprentice to a furniture maker, using the skills he developed maintaining the Belmont house. He attends reading classes in the evenings and has become part of the free black community here. But he asked me to convey something to you specifically. He says, "Tell the boy, Thomas, that blood doesn't determine character. I share blood with men who owned me, but I share values with people who freed me. He has a choice about what kind of man he becomes. The blood doesn't decide. He does. Thomas, you're 16. In a few years you'll inherit the estate and everything that comes with it. Samuel wanted you to know that inheritance is a choice, not just a destiny. You can choose what to keep and what to let go. Your aunt, Clara." Thomas read this letter dozens of times, memorizing the words. Blood doesn't determine character. It became something like a mantra for him. He began changing slowly, in small ways his parents barely noticed in their own deterioration. He started treating the enslaved people on the estate with more respect, learning their names, asking about their families. He began questioning his father's business decisions, suggesting improvements to living conditions. It's more efficient if they're healthy, he'd argue, using economics to mask morality. Charles, too drunk and depressed to fight much, often gave in. By 1852, Thomas was essentially managing the plantation. Charles was a ghost in his own house, haunted by guilt, alcohol, and the public knowledge of his family's shame. Margaret had withdrawn into religious mania, hosting prayer groups, donating money to missionary societies, seeking some kind of redemption through performance of piety. Victoria remained unmarried, now 21, past the prime age for marriage. She spent her time reading, writing, and teaching Anne about the realities of the world they lived in, lessons in truth rather than the comfortable lies their mother preferred. And in Philadelphia, Samuel was building a life. He'd married a free black woman named Ruth, a seamstress with her own business. They had a small house in a mixed neighborhood. Samuel had finished his apprenticeship and was working as a skilled furniture maker, his pieces known for their quality craftsmanship. He'd created a family on his own terms, a family that claimed him fully. In 1853, Charles Belmont fell seriously ill. The doctor diagnosed it as liver disease, almost certainly from years of heavy drinking. Charles deteriorated rapidly, his skin taking on a yellowish tint, his body weakening until he could barely leave his bed. Thomas, now 20, managed everything: the plantation, the finances, his mother's increasingly erratic behavior, his sister's welfare. On a July evening when Charles knew he was dying, he called Thomas to his bedside. Margaret was at church. They were alone. "There are things you need to know," Charles said weakly, "before I'm gone." "I know about Samuel," Thomas said quietly. "Everyone knows now. Not just about him, about the choices I made." Charles struggled to breathe. "My father put me in an impossible situation. When he died, Samuel was 10 years old. I was 27, newly married to your mother. The estate was in debt. I had responsibilities. You could have freed him. And done what? Sent a 10-year-old into the world alone? Free black children had no prospects, no safety. He'd have been re-enslaved by someone else or starved." Charles coughed painfully. "I told myself I was protecting him by keeping him here." "Were you?" Charles closed his eyes. "I don't know. I stopped knowing what was true and what was convenient somewhere along the way." When Victoria got sick, you used his blood. I did. And I've never felt more like a monster. Charles's voice broke. He saved my daughter, and I couldn't even acknowledge him. I couldn't even say thank you. Because saying thank you would mean admitting the relationship, and admitting the relationship would mean admitting you'd done wrong, admitting everything I'd built was wrong. Charles opened his eyes, looking at his son. Thomas, when you inherit this place, you'll face the same choices, the same system, the same impossibilities. I'll make different choices. Will you, when it's your children's futures at stake, your reputation, your economic survival? Charles grabbed Thomas's hand with surprising strength. The system doesn't forgive morality, it punishes it. Then the system should change. Charles laughed bitterly. You sound like the abolitionists. It'll take a war to change this, boy. Maybe not in my lifetime, but in yours. And when it comes, this whole world will burn. He died 3 days later, at the age of 47. His final words incoherent mumblings about blood and brothers and debts unpaid. At 20 years old, Thomas Belmont inherited a plantation, 83 enslaved people, substantial debts, and a family reputation in tatters. The first thing he did was review every record his father and grandfather had kept. He understood now that history was what you documented, what you preserved or destroyed. His grandfather had tried to erase Samuel by keeping minimal records. Victoria had countered by creating undeniable documentation. Thomas decided to continue Victoria's approach, create truthful records. He began documenting everything about the people enslaved on his property, full names, family relationships, skills, histories. He recorded births with both mother and father listed when known. He recorded deaths with causes and details. He created a comprehensive record of lives rather than just property inventories. His mother was horrified. You're making them seem like people. They are people, Mother. You know what I mean? You're creating documents that could be used against us. Against us? Or as evidence of truth? Margaret had no answer to that. Thomas also began changing operations. He couldn't free anyone. The law was absolute, and doing so would bankrupt the estate and leave him unable to help anyone. But he could improve conditions. Better housing, better food, access to medical care, keeping families together, allowing limited education for children. He knew these were small mercies within an immoral system. He knew he was still complicit. But he also knew that immediate, total abolition wasn't within his power. The law, the economy, his responsibilities to his family all constrained him. I'm trying to be less evil, he confessed to Victoria one evening. I know that's not the same as being good. It's more than father managed, Victoria replied. In 1854, Victoria finally received permission to correspond directly with Aunt Clara and Samuel. The letters that went back and forth over the next few years created a strange kind of relationship. Family members separated by law and distance, connected by blood and circumstance. Samuel wrote about his life, his furniture business growing, Ruth giving birth to a daughter they named Grace, his involvement with the Underground Railroad helping others escape bondage, his continued education. Victoria wrote about the plantation, the changes Thomas was implementing, their mother's declining health, Anne's education, the rumors of sectional conflict growing between North and South. They never used the words uncle and niece in the letters, some caution still operating even at distance. But the relationship was clear in the care of the words, in the details shared, in the mutual recognition of connection. By 1857, the political situation had become impossible to ignore. The conflict over slavery was tearing the country apart. Thomas attended political meetings where men spoke openly of secession, of war, of defending their way of life against northern aggression. He sat silent in these meetings, thinking about Samuel in Philadelphia, about the 83 people whose labor funded the very chairs these men sat in while planning rebellion. Victoria, now 26 and resigned to spinsterhood, had found a different kind of purpose. She'd begun teaching the enslaved children on the estate to read secretly in direct violation of Alabama law. If discovered, she could be imprisoned or fined. She didn't care. If the system is already breaking, she told Thomas, then its rules don't bind us anymore. Margaret discovered the illegal school in late 1857 and had a complete breakdown. She'd spent years trying to contain the damage to the family reputation, and now her own daughter was openly violating the law. "You're insane," Margaret screamed. "You've gone completely insane." "No, Mother, I've become sane." Victoria stood calmly in the face of her mother's hysteria. "You're the one who spent decades pretending family wasn't family, pretending blood wasn't blood. That's insanity." Margaret collapsed, and the doctor was called. He diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest and laudanum. Margaret took to her bed, where she would spend most of the remaining years, drifting in and out of drugged sleep. The family had fractured completely. Thomas managed the estate with increasing doubts about whether he even wanted to preserve it. Victoria ran her illegal school and corresponded with abolitionists. Anne, now 16 herself, was caught between two worlds, raised in the old system but educated by her sister in new truths. And then Fort Sumter was fired upon in April 1861. The war had begun. Thomas was immediately pressured to volunteer for the Confederate Army. Men his age, he was 28 now, were expected to fight, to defend their homeland against what was termed Northern invasion. He delayed, making excuses about needing to manage the estate, caring for his ill mother. But the social pressure was immense. Finally, in August of 1861, he accepted a commission as a lieutenant, more to stop the questions than from any conviction. Before he left, he did something extraordinary. He created a legal document, properly witnessed and notarized, declaring that upon his death, all enslaved people on the Belmont estate would be immediately freed, with provisions for them to receive parcels of land from the estate to start their own lives. It wasn't manumission. He legally couldn't do that under Alabama law, but it was a will, and wills had legal weight. "If I die in this war," he told Victoria, "the system dies here too." "Don't die," Victoria said fiercely. "Come back and dismantle it yourself." Thomas smiled sadly. "I'll try." He left for the war, and Victoria was left alone to manage the plantation with their increasingly unstable mother and teenage Anne. The war years were brutal. Food became scarce. The plantation's production dropped as more enslaved men were conscripted for military labor. Victoria struggled to keep everyone fed, walking a line between maintaining the estate and her growing belief that the entire system deserved to collapse. Letters from Thomas came irregularly. He was fighting in Tennessee, then Virginia, then Georgia. His letters grew darker, describing horrors he didn't have words for, questioning everything he'd been raised to believe. "I'm fighting alongside men who own no one, who are poor as dirt, who are dying to preserve a system that only benefits the wealthy," he wrote in 1863. "What are we even doing? Who does this serve?" And then, in July of 1863, a different kind of letter arrived, not from Thomas, but from his commanding officer. Thomas had been severely wounded at Gettysburg. The letter was clinical. Lieutenant Thomas Belmont had sustained serious injuries during the battle's second day. Shrapnel wounds to the abdomen, significant blood loss, infection likely. He was in a field hospital in Virginia, condition critical. Victoria read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated. Thomas was dying. She went immediately to her mother's room, where Margaret lay in her laudanum haze. "Thomas is wounded, severely. We need to go to him." Margaret's eyes focused slowly. "Virginia. We can't travel to Virginia. There's a war. He's dying, Mother. Then we'll pray." Margaret closed her eyes again. "God's will be done." Victoria stared at her mother's diminished form, then made a decision. She would go herself. The journey north was dangerous and complicated. Rail lines were disrupted by the war. Roads were unsafe. Victoria sold jewelry to fund the trip, obtained papers declaring her purpose as family emergency, and set out with Dinah as her only companion. They reached the field hospital in early August, a nightmarish place where hundreds of wounded men lay in crowded conditions, many beyond help. Thomas was conscious but weak, his abdomen wrapped in blood-stained bandages. The doctor took Victoria aside. "Infection has set in. He's lost significant blood. We have limited medical supplies. I'm sorry, Miss Belmont, but there's little we can do. Make him comfortable. That's the best option now. There's no treatment, nothing you can try. Not with our resources here. In a proper hospital, perhaps, but even then." The doctor trailed off. The prognosis was clear. Victoria sat with Thomas, holding his hand, watching him fade. He was semi-conscious, drifting in and out, sometimes lucid and sometimes delirious. In a moment of clarity, he gripped her hand. "The will, you found it?" "Yes, it's safe. Make sure it stands, no matter what Mother tries." "I will. And Victoria, tell Samuel. Tell him I understood. Eventually. Tell him I'm sorry it took me so long. You can tell him yourself when you recover." Thomas smiled weakly. "Don't lie to me. We both know." That night, Victoria sat in the nurse's area, thinking about blood, about how Samuel's blood had saved her 6 years ago, about how Thomas was dying now from blood loss, about how there was someone in Philadelphia whose blood was family blood, the same bloodline as Thomas. It was insane. It was impossible. Philadelphia was hundreds of miles away. There was a war. The logistics were impossible, and yet... Victoria found paper and wrote frantically, explaining the situation, begging for help. She sent the letter express to Clara's Philadelphia address, paying extra for fastest delivery. "Please," she wrote, "if there's any possibility, any chance, I'm begging you, he's dying. We need Samuel." She had no real hope the letter would arrive in time, or that Samuel would come even if it did. She was asking him to risk his freedom, to travel back into Confederate territory where he could be re-enslaved, to save the brother who'd inherited his bondage. Why would he come? Samuel received the letter 4 days later. He sat in his Philadelphia workshop, sawdust on his clothes, Victoria's desperate words in his hands. Ruth watched his face as he read. "What is it?" "My half-brother is dying in Virginia. Victoria is asking if I'll come." Ruth's eyes widened. "The brother who enslaved you? The brother who freed me, eventually, or enabled it at least." Samuel set the letter down. "They need blood, for a transfusion, like they did with Victoria." "Samuel, no." Ruth gripped his arm. "You can't go south. If they catch you, if anyone realizes you're a freed slave in Confederate territory, they'll re-enslave you, or worse. There are bounty hunters, slave catchers. I know." "Then you know you can't go." Samuel looked at his wife, then at the letter, then out the window at the free streets of Philadelphia, where he could walk as a man, not property. "He's dying," Samuel said quietly. "He's not your responsibility. He's my brother. He owned you." "I know." Samuel stood, began pacing. "Believe me, Ruth, I know. I know what they did. I know what they took from me. But he's also the one who stopped fighting when Clara wanted to buy me. He's the one who let me go. That's not the same as making it right." "No, but it's something." Samuel stopped pacing. "And Victoria, she sacrificed everything for me. Her reputation, her future, her family's standing. She made my existence official, acknowledged, recorded. She didn't have to do that." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I can't lose you. I'll be careful." "Careful doesn't matter if you're caught." They argued for hours. But Ruth knew her husband, knew the code of honor that guided him even when it cost him. He'd risked his own safety dozens of times helping escaped slaves through Philadelphia. He'd given his blood before to save family that didn't acknowledge him. He would go. Samuel left the next morning with Clara, who'd offered to escort him and provide cover. She would claim he was her servant if questioned. They had papers forged by abolitionist contacts, documents declaring Samuel as property of Clara Hayes, traveling under her protection. The irony of using false enslavement papers to travel safely wasn't lost on either of them. The journey took 8 days through war-torn country. They were stopped twice by Confederate patrols, but Clara's Charleston accent and imperious manner got them through. Samuel played the role of submissive servant, eyes down, silent, everything he'd been taught before freedom. Each moment he had to perform that submission was agony. They reached the Virginia Field Hospital on August 19, 1863. Victoria was sitting beside Thomas's bed when Dinah came to fetch her. "Miss Victoria, you need to come." Victoria found Samuel and Clara in the hospital's receiving area. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overcome by the reality that he'd actually come, that he'd risked everything. "You came," she finally whispered. "You asked," Samuel replied simply. There was no time for lengthy reunions. Thomas had deteriorated further. The infection was overwhelming his system. The doctor was skeptical about the transfusion attempt. "I've performed 2 this month. Both patients died. The procedure is simply too risky, too imprecise." "He's dying anyway," Victoria said. "What does he have to lose? And this man—" The doctor gestured to Samuel. "He's willing?" "I am," Samuel confirmed. The doctor shrugged, too exhausted from months of wartime medicine to argue. "Very well. I'll need several hours to prepare." They performed the transfusion that evening in a corner of the hospital, using the same primitive equipment that had been used for Victoria years before. Samuel lay on a cot beside Thomas, tubes connecting their arms, watching his blood flow into his brother's body. Thomas was barely conscious, but at one point his eyes opened and focused on Samuel's face. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came. I'm sorry. For everything. For—" "Save your strength," Samuel interrupted gently. "We'll talk when you're better." "If I'm better." "When?" Samuel insisted, squeezing his hand. "You don't get to die before making those changes you promised." Thomas managed a weak smile before drifting back into unconsciousness. The transfusion took 2 hours. When it was done, Samuel was weak and dizzy, having given more blood than was probably safe. Clara and Victoria helped him to a recovery area. "Now we wait," the doctor said. "If he survives the night without reaction, he has a chance." They kept vigil together, Victoria, Clara, Dinah, and Samuel. 4 people connected by blood, law, and circumstance, sitting in a Confederate field hospital while the war raged around them. "It's strange," Victoria said quietly around midnight. "6 years ago, your blood saved me. Now it might save Thomas." "Blood is just blood," Samuel said tiredly. "It doesn't carry morality, just life." "But family blood? I don't know if we're family," Samuel interrupted. "We share ancestry, that's biology. Family is something different. Family is choice and recognition and—" He trailed off, too exhausted to complete the thought. "You chose to come," Victoria said. "That's family." Clara spoke up. "Samuel has a family now, a wife, a daughter, a community that claims him fully. You should know that. He's not alone waiting for Belmont recognition." "I know," Victoria said. "I'm glad for it." As dawn approached, Thomas's fever broke. His breathing stabilized. The doctor examined him with surprise. "The infection appears to be retreating. His body accepted the transfusion well." The doctor shook his head in wonder. "Remarkable compatibility. Are you certain this man isn't family?" Samuel and Victoria exchanged glances but said nothing. Thomas survived. Over the following weeks, he slowly regained strength. Samuel stayed for 10 days until it was clear Thomas would recover, then prepared to return to Philadelphia with Clara. Before leaving, Thomas asked to speak with Samuel privately. They sat outside the hospital, 2 men who looked remarkably similar, separated by everything except genetics. "I can't undo what was done to you," Thomas said. "I can't give you back the years, the childhood, the recognition you should have had. No, you can't. But I can promise you this, when this war is over, however it ends, I will never own another human being. The Belmont estate will not continue as it was. That's easy to say if the South loses. Even if we win, Thomas said firmly. Even if somehow the Confederacy survives and slavery continues legally. I'm done with it. Samuel studied his brother's face. You mean that? I do. Your blood is in my veins now, literally. I can't pretend anymore that we're not connected. We were always connected. The blood transfusion just made it undeniable. They sat in silence for several minutes. What will you do? Thomas finally asked. After the war? Build furniture, raise my daughter, live free. Samuel smiled slightly. Maybe that doesn't sound like much, but it's everything I never expected to have. It sounds like a good life. It is. They parted without touching, too many eyes around, too much danger in any display of familiarity. But as Samuel walked away, Thomas called out, "Samuel!" Samuel turned. "Thank you. For coming. For the blood. For everything." Samuel nodded once, then left. He and Clara made it back to Philadelphia safely. The return journey was even more dangerous. Confederate deserters, Union patrols, roads destroyed by fighting. But they managed. Samuel never saw any of the Belmonts in person again. The war ended in April 1865 with Confederate surrender. Thomas returned to Alabama in June, wounded in leg and spirit, to find the plantation in chaos. The enslaved population had dispersed. Some left immediately upon hearing of emancipation. Others stayed temporarily with nowhere else to go. A few remained permanently, uncertain about how to navigate freedom after a lifetime of bondage. The main house was damaged, looted by passing troops, Union or Confederate, no one knew. The fields were overgrown. The economy had collapsed. Confederate currency was worthless. The Belmont fortune, built over generations, was essentially gone. Margaret had died during the war's final year, her heart failing in her laudanum sleep. Anne had married a local merchant during Thomas's absence, seeking stability in a collapsing world. Victoria, now 34, was still there, managing what remained, trying to help the newly freed people navigate their new reality without resources or preparation. Thomas kept his promise. He sold parcels of land to former enslaved families at minimal prices, providing what little capital he could scrape together to help them start. He didn't have much to give. The plantation was in massive debt, but he gave what he could. "It's not enough," he told Victoria. "Nothing I do will ever be enough." "No," she agreed, "but it's better than nothing." They wrote to Samuel informing him of the war's end, of the changes, of their mother's death. Samuel wrote back, his letter formal but not unkind. "I'm sorry for your loss. Whatever Margaret's faults, she was your mother, and grief is grief. I'm glad the war is over. I'm glad the system has ended, at least legally. I know the reality is more complicated. Freedom without resources isn't much freedom. Thomas, I appreciate your efforts to make amends. I recognize they come at personal cost, but I want you both to understand something. I don't need Belmont recognition anymore. I needed it once, desperately, when I was young and enslaved, and believed that acknowledgement might change my circumstances. But I've built a life now without it. I'm Samuel Freeman, furniture maker, husband, father, free man. That's my identity. What happened at Belmont Estate is history. It shaped me, but doesn't define me. I hold no hatred for you personally, but I also feel no particular connection beyond shared biology. You're my blood relatives, yes, but my family is here in Philadelphia, built on choice rather than circumstance. I wish you well in rebuilding, truly, but we should let our connection remain what it is, a story from the past, documented and acknowledged, but not requiring ongoing relationship. Respectfully, Samuel Freeman. Thomas and Victoria lived the rest of their lives in the diminished Belmont house, never fully recovering financially or socially from the war and scandal. Thomas never married. He spent his years trying to make reparations in small ways, providing employment to freed people, supporting schools, testifying in legal cases about property rights for black landowners. It was never enough, and he knew it. Victoria also remained unmarried, finding purpose in teaching and in preserving historical records. She continued documenting everything, creating an extensive archive of the plantation's true history, the comfortable lies and the uncomfortable truths. Anne had 3 children and maintained distance from her siblings, embarrassed by the family's reputation. She never spoke about Samuel, never acknowledged the history to her own children. In 1878, Thomas received word that Samuel had died of pneumonia in Philadelphia at age 52. He'd left behind a widow, 3 children, and a successful furniture business that would be carried on by his sons. Thomas attended no funeral. It would have been complicated, even dangerous, given the racial climate. But he placed a notice in the Philadelphia newspaper, in memory of Samuel Freeman, formerly of Alabama, a man of character and dignity. His blood flows in the veins of those who remember him. May he rest in the peace he earned. It was the closest to public acknowledgement he could manage. Victoria died in 1889 at age 58, never having married or left Alabama. In her will, she left her extensive historical archives to the Alabama Historical Society, with instructions that they be preserved permanently. Those archives contained everything: the ledgers showing Samuel's birth, the medical records of both transfusions, Victoria's original deposition, Judge Morrison's testimony, letters between family members, Thomas's will promising freedom to enslaved people, newspaper clippings about the scandal. She documented it all, creating an unassailable historical record of what had happened. Thomas died in 1891 at age 58, alone in the decrepit Belmont house. In his final letter, written to Samuel's eldest son, he wrote, "Your father was a better man than I ever managed to be. He was denied everything: family, freedom, education, recognition, and yet became someone of genuine worth. I was given everything and still failed to be truly good. I share his blood, but I wish I shared his character. Please know that he mattered, that he was acknowledged eventually, that the debt we owed him was never forgotten, even if it could never be repaid. Respectfully, Thomas Belmont." The Belmont estate was sold in 1892 to pay debts. The house was eventually demolished in 1920. The land was divided into smaller farms, but the record survived. In the 1930s, a historian researching slavery in Alabama discovered Victoria's archives at the Historical Society. The story of Samuel and the Belmont family became a case study in academic papers about the complexities of Southern family structures, the hidden racial mixing that the South's racial ideology denied, and the moral contradictions inherent in the slave system. In 1947, exactly 100 years after the first transfusion, a medical researcher studying the history of blood transfusion procedures discovered the Belmont medical records. The fact that 2 successful transfusions had been performed between closely related individuals decades before blood types were understood became a footnote in medical history. And Samuel's descendants living in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Chicago learned about their ancestors' story. They learned about the plantation where he'd been enslaved by his own half-brother, about the blood he'd given twice to save relatives who couldn't acknowledge him, about his escape to freedom and the life he'd built despite everything. They learned that their great-great-grandfather had been denied his family name but had built a legacy more meaningful than the Belmont name ever carried. Because in the end, the Belmont line died out. Anne's descendants changed their name through marriage, distancing themselves from the scandal. No one carried the Belmont name into the 20th century. But the Freeman name continued, carried by Samuel's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, carried by people who knew their ancestors' story, knew about the blood that had been taken and given, knew about the family that had denied him but couldn't erase him. The blood survived. The truth survived. The legacy survived. Not because it was acknowledged by those who should have recognized it, but because one young woman decided documentation mattered more than comfort, and because one freed man chose to give life even to those who denied him his own. The Belmont plantation is gone. The house is gone. The fortune is gone. But in archives, in historical records, in family trees carefully documented, the story remains. A slave who shared blood with the master's family. A secret hidden for decades, then exposed. a family fractured by truth, and a man who became free despite everything designed to keep him in bondage. The blood they shared couldn't be denied forever, and in the end truth proved more powerful than even the law.